Hi, boys and girls, welcome back. Today we are talking about problem and solution. Remember, problem is just a fancy word for what goes wrong in the story. What is going to make that character sad? Solution is how the problem is solved. So, how is it fixed? It's what makes the character happy again. A lot of times we are going to learn about the problem in the beginning of the story because throughout the story, the characters are trying to fix the problem. Many times you are going to learn about the solution at the end of the story. So the problem's typically at the beginning and the solution is oftentimes found at the very end. Problem is what goes wrong and solution is how it is fixed. We're going to read the story The Biggest Pumpkin Ever again. And as we read this story, I want you to be thinking about what is going wrong? What's the problem for the character? I want you to also be thinking about how is that problem solved? How did they fix the problem? Once there lived two mice who fell in love with the same pumpkin. Clayton, the house mouse, noticed it one day in the vegetable garden. It was still little and green, but Clayton thought he could make it grow really big. It might even get big enough to win the grand prize at the town pumpkin contest. Desmond, the field mouse, discovered the pumpkin the same day. He thought that if he helped it grow, it could become the biggest jack-o'-lantern in the neighborhood. That afternoon, Clayton watered the pumpkin. He also mixed up some fertilizer and manure and water. He spread the mixture around the pumpkin to make it grow larger. That very same night, Desmond went into the garden. He watered the pumpkin too. He also spread some manure mixed with water around it. The next day, Clayton watered and fertilized the pumpkin again. The next night, Desmond did the same, and the pumpkin began to grow. By the end of a month, the pumpkin was so large that Clayton couldn't believe his eyes. "My goodness," said Clayton's mother, "and it's not even full grown." Clayton shrugged. "All I do is water it," he said. Clayton's mother whispered in his ear. "If you want the pumpkin to grow bigger faster," she said, "you should use sugar water." That night, Desmond brought his brother Morris to see the pumpkin. Morris knew everything there was to know about growing things. "That's some pumpkin," he said. Desmond shrugged. "All I do is water it," he said. Morris whispered in his ear. "You should try using sugar water," he said. The next day, Clayton dug a small hole beside the pumpkin vine. In the hole, he placed a bowl full of sugar water. He cut into the vine a few inches from the pumpkin. In the cut, he put one end of a piece of candle wick. Then he put the other end in the bowl of sugar water. That night, on the other side of the pumpkin, Desmond did exactly the same thing. Within a week, the pumpkin was twice the size it had been. Within 2 weeks, it was absolutely enormous. Clayton was amazed. He ran down the road and peeked into his friend Jimmy's pumpkin patch. The pumpkin Jimmy was growing for the contest looked much smaller. Clayton scratched his head. "I have an amazing pumpkin," he said out loud, "and I think I'm going to win the contest." That night, Desmond and his brother Morris spent a long time looking at the pumpkin. "How do you think it got that big?" Desmond asked. Morris shrugged. "A little luck, a little skill." "It's going to make some jack-o'-lantern," said Desmond. "It sure is," said Morris. A week later, Clayton noticed the pumpkin was bigger than the family car. During the day, everyone he knew came by to admire it. And at night, all the field mice gathered around to do the same. By now, summer was almost over. In a week, the pumpkin would be full grown and start turning yellowish and then orange. A few weeks after that, it would be ripe and ready for the pumpkin contest. Clayton could hardly wait. The pumpkin was growing so fast, it would soon be larger than his house. Then he had a terrible thought. If the pumpkin was so big, how would he get it to the contest? It wouldn't fit in his red wagon. It wouldn't even fit in a truck. Clayton decided to worry about this when the time came. That night, the weather grew colder. Thinking there might be an early frost, Clayton rushed out to the pumpkin with his blanket. One was not enough. Soon he was rushing back and forth carrying all the blankets from the house. As he worked, he hummed a little song, and as he hummed, he heard someone else singing. He also began to realize that someone else was covering the pumpkin with blankets. Desmond, too, had seen the danger of an early frost. He, too, had brought blankets for the pumpkin, and as he worked, he sang a little song, and as he sang, he began to realize that someone else was working and humming. Clayton stopped humming. He put down his pile of blankets and peered around the corner of the pumpkin. Desmond stopped singing. He put down his blankets and peered around the corner of the pumpkin. The two of them bumped heads and fell down. "You've been feeding the pumpkin," said Clayton. "You've been feeding the pumpkin," said Desmond. "That's why it's got so big," said Clayton. "That's why it got so big," said Desmond. They burst out laughing. When everything had been explained, Clayton said, I know I'll win the contest if I can get the pumpkin into town." Desmond smiled. "I'll help you. Just let me carve the pumpkin into a jack-o'-lantern for Halloween when the contest is over." "It's a deal," said Clayton. "A deal," said Desmond, and they shook on it. The morning of the contest was bright and sunny. Mice were bringing their pumpkins to the town square by truck and car and wagon. Some were rolling them along the ground. Suddenly, they all stopped short. Over the fields came the biggest pumpkin anyone had ever seen. It was being pulled by 100 field mice on motorcycles. When the pumpkin reached town, it was too big for any of the streets. Clayton had to explain why they couldn't bring it to the square. The mayor understood at once. He led the crowd to the giant pumpkin and pinned the first prize ribbon on its side. Then everyone danced around it. "Who would have believed this?" said Clayton as he danced. "Who would have believed this?" said Desmond at the same moment. When the celebration was over, the 100 field mice pulled the pumpkin back to the field. The day before Halloween, they carved it into the best jack-o'-lantern ever. And on Halloween night, its wonderful smiling face could be seen glowing for miles around. Okay, boys and girls, let's think about the problem and the solution in this story, The Biggest Pumpkin Ever. Now, remember, the problem is what goes wrong in the story. I think you probably realize that the problem really started at the very beginning. I'm going to reread the first page, and I want us to talk about it. It says, "Once there were two mice who fell in love with the same pumpkin." I don't know about you, but I saw this as an issue. Think about it like being in your classroom. If you and a friend want the same toy, is that going to be bad? Yeah, you've got to work it out. So we knew from the very beginning that this was going to be a problem. Throughout the beginning and middle of the story, both Desmond and Clayton were trying to work on this pumpkin. They were both doing things to make it grow really big and mighty so that they could use it. Remember, Clayton was using it for that big pumpkin contest, and Desmond was going to use the pumpkin as a jack-o'-lantern for Halloween. So throughout the story, they're both doing things to grow this pumpkin really big. So we know our problem. Do you remember this part where they finally realize that both of them are working on the pumpkin? They bumped heads and burst out laughing. That was a good attitude to have, right? And they're talking to each other here saying, "You've been helping." And Clayton says, "Oh, you've been helping." What did they do that solved their problem of both wanting that same pumpkin? Do you remember? It says, when everything had been explained, Clayton said, I know I'll win the contest if I can get the pumpkin to town. Desmond smiled. I'll help you. Just let me carve the pumpkin into a jack-o'-lantern for Halloween when the contest is over. It's a deal, said Clayton. A deal, said Desmond. So how was our problem solved? Our two characters made a deal. They decided to work together so that they could both use that giant pumpkin that they had been growing over time. So again, problem is what goes wrong in the story. It's what could make the character sad. So the problem in this story was that Clayton and Desmond both were working to grow this pumpkin into a giant pumpkin for the two of them to use. Solution is how the problem is solved, what makes the characters happy again. And in this book, the solution was that Desmond and Clayton worked together and made a deal to both be able to use that pumpkin that they had spent so much time and energy growing. I hope that you enjoyed this story. See you guys later.